drones over Poland, jets in Estonian airspace, and military exercises in Belarus that prompted the Polish government to temporarily close the border. While most of the fighting of the war in Ukraine has been confined to either Ukrainian or Russian territory, the broader confrontation between Russia and NATO can spill over to flashpoints well beyond that. These grey zone altercations and alleged hybrid tactics arguably illustrate the fact that the war in Ukraine isn't just a military and economic effort, it's also a political one, where politics, signalling and public opinion can carry the same kind of importance as economic output in ultimately shaping battlefield outcomes. And so today, I want to look at some of those recent NATO-Russia flashpoints, examining what it's claimed that Russia has done, why it may have done it, and what some of the responses we've seen from NATO states so far might tell us about alliance cohesion, military readiness, and whether Russia is likely to be onto a repeatable winning strategy here, or if poking the big blue blob risks becoming strategically self-defeating. To do that, I'll start with a brief refresher on what escalation management and hybrid warfare might look like from a Russian perspective, and then zoom in on two recent examples, Russian drones over Poland and MiG-31s in Estonian airspace, asking in both cases what both sides have said about it, what the motive behind those actions may have been, and how NATO's chosen to respond so far, before getting a little more forward-looking and asking what options remain on the table, demonstrating some of the bigger challenges that both sides face in this exchange. For NATO, alliance politics and escalation concerns, and for Russia, the issue that NATO has plenty of options to retaliate without necessarily having to shoot back. Note, I am recording this while recovering from a bit of a nasty cold, so if that comes through in my voice, apologies in advance. Before we jump into it though, let me welcome back a returning sponsor. And so today, let me welcome back long-term sponsors of the channel, Private Internet Access. In 2025, the reality is that the internet might be global, but our digital environment can very much have borders and more than a few rough edges. And so if you're looking to reduce risk without smashing up your modem and communicating entirely by carrier pigeon, then just like an armoured vehicle might try and combine good tactics, camouflage, armor plate and an active protection system in order to maximise its chance of survival, you might want to layer different tools and practices together. Stay sensible with what you click and what you post, use strong passwords, embrace a healthy sense of skepticism, and then if you're like me, you might also want to add a VPN. With a click, what that can allow you to do is reroute internet traffic, change your publicly perceived IP address, and potentially shift how your activity is logged, with PIA advertising a no-logs policy, which they say has been audited and court-tested. Their server network is significant, spanning 91 countries in all 50 US states, and that network comes with the convenience of being available cross-platform, which might be handy given a single PIA subscription allows you to cover an unlimited number of devices. So if you're interested in a VPN with an open source code base that I've been using for some time now, the link in the description will give you access to an 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 additional bonus months, covered by a 30-day money-back guarantee. And so with my thanks to PIA as always, let's get back to it. So to give a little bit of context here before we jump into these specific incidents, let's quickly reintroduce some concepts that are very important to understanding what we've just seen: hybrid warfare and grey zone operations. To oversimplify, in the world of international relations, the grey zone is that murky space that exists between peace and war. It's a messy zone of ambiguity, hybrid actions, and nations sometimes pushing to see just how much they can get away with without causing an escalation to an all-out state-on-state brawl. That kind of ambiguity and the role it plays in Russian strategic thinking will often come through if you watch Russian political figures try and answer even a relatively simple question, like, is Russia at war with NATO or any NATO states? Because in the space of the same week or two, you might see someone like Sergei Lavrov saying that there is no war and Russia has no intention to start one, Russia's ambassador to France saying that there will be a war if NATO were to shoot down Russian aircraft, and other political figures like Dmitry Peskov or Sergei Lavrov again, saying that Russia is actually already at war with NATO, with Lavrov being quoted in Russian state media saying, quote, NATO and the European Union want to declare, in fact have already declared a real war on my country and are directly participating in it. But Russia obviously doesn't act like it's in an actual conventional war with NATO. Far from it, we've actually seen Russia strip military resources away from parts of the NATO border, like the section of the Russian border facing Finland, in part to help meet the ongoing military requirements of the war in Ukraine. So when Russia says they're at war with NATO, the United States or European powers, beyond that just being a rhetorical device, they're also describing a state of affairs that on an escalation spectrum, I've got a simplified example of one on the right there, fits in that gap between true peace and all-out war. They have an incentive to find ways to weaken NATO or gain an advantage over it, which is where we can see various tactics and techniques short of war come into play. A lot of the tools you might see as part of a grey zone or hybrid warfare strategy are going to have a couple of common characteristics. They might be hard to attribute to the country that actually launched them. Think cyber attacks or acts of sabotage. In other cases, they might be non-violent but still potentially coercive. Think economic pressure or military posturing. In many cases, the target of hybrid strategies won't be the ability of an enemy to fight, but rather its social and political will to do so. To quote from a NATO document on hybrid warfare, quote, "Hybrid methods are used to blur the lines between war and peace and attempt to sow doubt in the minds of target populations. They aim to destabilise and undermine societies," end quote. From a cold strategic perspective, a hybrid warfare approach might be particularly useful if you're a country with strengths in a couple of key areas and are trying to look for ways to deal with a potentially more powerful opponent. You might not need to have the economical military heft of the United States, for example, to run a really good cyber warfare or propaganda section. Taking a grey zone approach, though, does have potential risks and weaknesses. If you're really good at propaganda and cyber warfare, for example, but have a pretty shit conventional military, then if you push things too far on the hacking, your opponent might have incentive to kick the conflict up an escalation level, move things from the cyber to the kinetic, for example, and then see who wins a fight between a modem and a JDAM. For reasons I'll come back to later then, I'd argue Russia is in a position of escalation inferiority against NATO. The resource gap is just so significant that despite talking about it an awful lot, an actual war with NATO is something Russia can very much not afford. Their incentive then, I'd argue, is to try and achieve as much as they can without reaching that level. The potential goals and payoffs of poking at NATO are many and varied. Diverting resources from Ukraine to NATO's own defences, increasing public nervousness and apprehension about war, which might encourage some to support a rapid end to the war, even if it means giving in to Russian conditions, undermining allied political cohesion, gathering intelligence, and in a best-case scenario, maybe identifying a vulnerability that could be exploited with future action. Basically applying that old maxim attributed to Lenin but which appeared in Richard Nixon's biography, probe with the bayonet, and if you encounter mush, proceed. If you encounter steel, withdraw. And if the question is how might Moscow go about probing NATO resolve and capabilities, the last few weeks might provide some telling examples. To look at recent examples then, I want to start by going a little bit out of chronological order and looking at Estonia first. Namely the report that on the 19th of September, 3 armed Russian MiG-31 aircraft entered Estonian airspace, and despite reportedly being told essentially to rack off, remained there for about 12 minutes. The reason I'm choosing to start here, rather than with the drones, is that from an escalation perspective, in many ways manned aircraft are just different. Compared to a drone, for instance, when it comes to manned aircraft, attribution is likely to be much simpler, especially when you're talking about a very distinct aircraft like MiG-31. A hacked-together FPV could hypothetically come from anywhere. But if you see a B-1B Lancer bombing someone, no one's going to blame Argentina. Russia is currently the only country flying the MiG-31, so when you see one, the game of guess who isn't particularly difficult. Also, unlike drones, when it comes to manned aircraft, it's harder to explain around potential navigation errors, quote-unquote, by just relying on the classic "they were affected by electronic warfare" excuse. Yes, pilots might be highly reliant on their onboard systems to navigate, although obviously, as you can see on the right there, sometimes the quality of that equipment might vary aircraft to aircraft. But unlike with a drone, with a manned aircraft, you do have a backup if the electronic systems go haywire. It's called the pilot navigating, the way they used to before the era of magic boxes that told you where you were. And then the final difference is just the very different level of risk in multiple respects. A manned aircraft is often going to be a more expensive, valuable asset than a drone. And because there's a human life involved now, the potential escalation risk of losing that aircraft is also much higher. That said, from a historical perspective, countries sending aircraft to essentially poke one another, for lack of a better term, is not at all uncommon. It's also not strictly speaking illegal, especially if you're just talking about actions inside an Air Defence Identification Zone, ADIZ. These are the zones many countries have established that go beyond their national airspace, where they'll often request incoming aircraft identify themselves and their intent. If Russian bombers are flying over the North Sea towards the United Kingdom, for example, the UK can't legally take military action against them unless they're taking hostile action or violating UK airspace. But for hopefully obvious reasons, they're usually not going to wait for a potential violation to occur before sending up a couple of interceptors to kindly ask the Russians what they're doing. And just in the last fortnight, we saw 2 cases roughly like that, involving Russian aircraft and NATO airspace. We saw 2 Russian strategic bombers with a pair of escorting Sukhoi 35s fly into the Alaskan Air Defence Identification Zone, prompting NORAD to send up a casual 9 aircraft in response, 4 F-16s, an E-3 and 4 KC-135 tankers. Around a day later, a pair of Hungarian Griffin fighters were scrambled in Lithuania to intercept a group of 5 Russian aircraft, 3 MiG-31s, a Sukhoi 35 and a Sukhoi 30, that were detected flying near, but not in, Allied airspace over the Baltic Sea. But flying near a country's airspace and flying into it are very different propositions. Although even just since February 2022, there have been claimed incidents of it happening. The Swedes, who remember were not NATO members at the time, reported back in March 2022, for example, that 4 Russian fighters violated their airspace near the island of Gotland, with another Russian aircraft, a single Sukhoi 24, staging a bit of a repeat in June 2024. But this more recent incident, this time in Estonian airspace, was different in that it involved more aircraft, 3 MiG-31s, and a considerable longer incursion, lasting roughly 12 minutes. What you can see on the right there is an airspace map released by the Estonian government of the area north of Estonia over the Baltic Sea. And I'll note this handout was actually shown on the floor of the United Nations Security Council. That northern purple line denotes Finnish airspace, the southern one Estonian airspace, but running between the two of them from Russian airspace is an international corridor, allowing aircraft from all nations, including Russia, to navigate the Baltic Sea, and used by the Russians fairly frequently to transfer aircraft from Russia proper to their Kaliningrad enclave and vice versa. According to the Estonians, though, on the morning of the 19th September, a trio of Russian aircraft apparently decided to take a bit of a shortcut. 3 MiG-31s that hadn't filed a flight plan and were flying with their transponders off, allegedly flying a bit more directly to Kaliningrad than they legally should have. As you might expect, the MiGs were identified before they entered Estonian airspace, and at different stages, 3 separate sets of Allied aircraft were reportedly scrambled in response. Finnish FA-18s, Swedish Griffins, and Italian F-35s. An interception took place, which is why we have close-up photos of the Russian aircraft that have been subsequently released, but it's reported the Russian aircraft didn't respond to communications on any radio channel. They could presumably see the NATO fighters, and if their communications equipment was working, presumably hear them as well, but they essentially proceeded under escort and in silence until they eventually left Estonian airspace. There are various aspects of this story that different media organisations are focused on, but for me, some of the most interesting implications flow from the type of aircraft involved, specifically in Russia's case the MiG-31, NATO designation Foxhound. Normally, I'd argue at a big picture level with these stories, the exact equipment involved usually doesn't matter. If you read a story about a Russian tank attack, it's usually not going to matter whether they're T-90s or T-80s. In this case, though, I think there are a couple of features of the Foxhound that make its presence relevant. The aircraft first entered Soviet service in 1981 as a large 2-seat all-weather interceptor. In that respect, it was a significant improvement over the older single-seat MiG-25 Foxbat, which earned the degree of notoriety because the United States significantly overestimated its capabilities, helping to contribute to a massive overreaction in the form of the F-15. But while MiG-25 might not have been the aircraft that NATO intelligence originally thought it was, the success of Foxhound was in many ways a significant step up. MiG-31 was not designed as a dogfighter. It was designed to go out there with massive engines and a big radar and hunt targets including NATO cruise missiles coming in at low altitude or bombers coming in up high. And that basic design brief produced at least 2 relevant features that would have been understood to NATO and relevant in this situation. The first is that unless a pilot is willing to make a one-way trip, the vast majority of MiG-31s out there don't pose any kind of significant threat to ground targets. This is not, contrary to some of the reporting I've seen, an attack jet, it's a dedicated interceptor. So if NATO sees a MiG-31 and identifies it as such, the chance of mistakenly assuming it might be there to attack a piece of infrastructure is comparatively low. There is, of course, one small exception. A small part of the MiG-31 fleet has been modified to MiG-31K standard. Those give up a lot of their air-to-air potential in order to be able to carry and launch a single Killjoy air-launched ballistic missile, which obviously has the express purpose of posing a threat to ground targets. But 1, you'd assume NATO intelligence generally has a pretty good idea of where those are at any given time. 2, given the range of the missile, you'd assume in most cases the Russians would be able to hit their intended target from Russian airspace and achieve greater surprise than flying into NATO airspace first. And 3, even if NATO didn't know the exact type ahead of time, it would have become apparent once the intercept had taken place. Here's one of the images that's been released of one of the Russian MiG-31s in question, and 2 things immediately stand out. 1, it clearly isn't carrying a massive hypersonic air-to-ground missile, just 3 short-ranged air-to-air heat seekers. And also in this image, we can see the aircraft number. Russian military aircraft can often be quite clearly identified by both their number and the colour of that number. On the right there, for example, you can see 3 MiG-31Ks, 36 blue, and 92 and 93 red. The Foxhound in this image is 67 blue. It's been photographed in the past and identified as a MiG-31BM, an interceptor, not a ground attack aircraft. So if you're a NATO commander trying to assess the threat these Russian aircraft might pose as part of a decision on whether to shoot them down or not, for example, at best, long before the intercept was made, and worst, shortly after the intercept was made, it would have become clear the only threat these aircraft imminently posed was to any air targets in their immediate vicinity. If you were the Russians and wanted to send up military jets that could be spun as not posing any potential threat to NATO, this might be a decent choice. And if, as Russia, you wanted to exert a degree of control over how and when this interception happened and how it played out, then another aspect of the MiG-31 would probably become relevant. It's very, very fast. To this day, MiG-31 is probably the fastest interceptor in service with anyone, anywhere. At high altitudes, and this thing can fly considerably higher than a lot of the other fighters out there, the aircraft will reportedly safely max out at around 2.8 times the speed of sound. By contrast, officially, an F-35 is going to max out at about Mach 1.6. The Swedish Griffin, just over Mach 2, which means two things. One, if the Russians had wanted to make that interception very difficult or break off once it had occurred, then on paper, their aircraft very much had the performance to do so, which starts to make the fact that an interception occurred and the way it occurred look increasingly deliberate. Because one interesting element to come out of the Estonian brief to the UN Security Council was that the Russian fighters didn't just spend 12 minutes in Estonian airspace, it's that they travelled approximately 100 kilometres in the process. Even if we assume the Estonians were understating it a bit and the actual number was north of 100 kilometres, it still implies that a flight of aircraft designed for high sustained speeds was basically slow boating at subsonic at a level that some civilian airliners would be able to catch. Basically, given the airframe's capabilities, the Russians were playing the opposite of hard to get, basically flying straight and slow, as if they were almost waiting for NATO to turn up. If, hypothetically, the goal had been to poke through NATO airspace with lower risk of actually being intercepted, you can imagine a very different flight profile. The MiG-31s taking off in Russian territory, gaining altitude, and then just dashing across the line high and fast. Instead, this looks more consistent with a trio of Russian pilots receiving the enviable orders of taking a leisurely aerial stroll through NATO airspace with a comparatively light armament, and then just see if NATO would shoot them down or not. That's consistent with the way we've seen some NATO figures describe the incident, confirming the assessment that the Russian aircraft didn't appear to pose a military threat, but at the same time were stubbornly resistant to instructions. Acknowledging the communications, for example, from the Italian pilots who intercepted them, but not following those instructions and proceeding as they were until they eventually left Estonian airspace. Russia's official position, for whatever it's worth, is that no airspace violation actually occurred, and the whole thing is a massive conspiracy against Russia. Russia's defense ministry reportedly insisted that the Foxhounds were on a, quote, scheduled flight in strict compliance with international airspace regulations and did not violate the borders of other states, end quote. Those kind of assertions prompted some rather amusing scenes in the UN Security Council, when the Estonian delegation essentially responded to the call for evidence by essentially going bet, proceeding to show off not just maps of the alleged incursion and photos of the aircraft as we've already seen, but also radar data as well. Throughout their journey, these Russian aircraft would have been on a whole host of radar screens. But the challenge here from a media perspective is that no matter how much sensor data you have, it's almost always going to be possible for the Kremlin to just declare itself the victim of a conspiracy. All of the data is fake. And so for me, looking at this from a more zoomed out strategic perspective, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence probably isn't the flight itself, but the broader pattern of multiple incidents. Because you didn't just have 3 Foxhounds reportedly flying through Estonian airspace, but you also had incidents like this one on the 19th of September, where, according to Warsaw, a pair of Russian fighters made a low-altitude pass over a Polish oil platform in the Baltic Sea, violating its safety zone in the process. This was a somewhat different incident to the Estonian one. The oil platform wasn't in Polish territorial waters, but also safety zones around objects like that exist for a reason. Most air forces out there aren't in the business of just buzzing platforms like that for shits and gigs, and so for me, a deliberate attempt to poke at NATO seems like one of the most reasonable explanations. Essentially what I'm saying is that while you might want to give the benefit of the doubt to a single incident as an accident or mere incompetence, when you start seeing multiple incidents of a similar nature in relatively quick succession, pattern recognition starts to kick in, and I'd suggest it starts to look more and more like a concerted Russian effort to test NATO's air defences and its political cohesion, which takes us from Estonia and a Polish oil rig to the Polish eastern border and the drone incursions of early September. The incursion in question reportedly took place on the evening of September 9th. At time of recording, I believe it's reported the wrecks of about 17 drones have been discovered, and you can see a map showing most of those on the right there. The first thing that stands out is that while a number of the crash sites are relatively close to the Ukrainian border, The overall distribution and clustering stretches much further to the west. 4 of the crash sites on that map are further west than Warsaw, and somehow one of them is most of the way towards the northern port city of Gdansk, which is a heck of a navigation error if the system in question was meant to be making its way towards Ukraine, and something we'll come back to a bit later. A big thing to say up front, of course, is that in some ways this wasn't really a first. Since the earlier stages of the Russian invasion, missiles and drones have had the observable tendency to go on European tours, planned or otherwise. Romania reported the discovery of what was believed to be the wreckage of a Russian drone back in 2023, and by this stage Poland's souvenir collection reportedly includes not just drone debris, but also stuff like a Russian Kh-55 missile. The harsh reality is that with this much ordnance being launched on a regular basis, much of it either being drones built by the lowest bidder, or missile systems that in some cases date back to the Soviet era, especially in the face of heavy electronic warfare activity, you'd expect a non-zero rate of navigational error, whether that be the occasional Ukrainian air defense missile going rogue, or every now and again, a Russian drone or missile choosing to defect to Europe. History provides examples of even manned systems sometimes failing to even hit the correct country, with the US and UK during the Second World War, for example, managing to repeatedly bomb Switzerland. So even with the advantage of modern technology, incidents involving 1 or 2 systems might sometimes be written off as technical failure or accidents. But in key respects, this was very different to those previous incidents, with the number one differentiator being scale. Even in the context of nights where Russia was launching very large combined missile and drone strikes against Ukrainian targets, most reported border violations occurred on a very small scale, oftentimes just an individual unit. 20-something drones, with one of them making it most of the way to the Baltic Sea, is a different story. Not only harder to write off as mere technical error, but also a greater concern to anyone on the ground. That links to the second factor that made this incident different: how NATO chose to respond to it. I'd argue the general NATO response to previous Russian drone incursions has tended to be not responding, or in some cases, not even noticing until sometime after the drone has already crashed. In a number of cases, the first time the public became aware that an airspace violation had occurred was when the debris of the drone or missile was discovered. In other cases, we've seen states decide to track Russian systems violating NATO airspace, but instead of engaging them, simply monitor them until, in at least some cases, they flew back into Ukraine against Ukrainian targets. In this case, though, we actually saw a small number of shoot-downs. Polish F-16s and Dutch F-35s were both reportedly involved. A number of drones were claimed downed, albeit at the reported cost of an AMRAAM fired by a Polish F-16 malfunctioning and subsequently crashing into a civilian building, thankfully without the warhead detonating. Warsaw's overall initial response to the drone incursion, though, was much more political than military. Rather than turning to NATO's Article 5, the attack on one is an attack on all clause, they instead chose to very publicly invoke Article 4, which requires the parties to come together and consult in cases where, in the opinion of any of the alliance members, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any NATO state is threatened. In that sense, Article 4 can either function as an endpoint in and of itself, bringing the alliance members together to discuss an urgent issue, and then potentially just leaving it at that. Or it can serve as a starting point, bringing a matter to the table that might eventually become an Article 5 issue. A demonstration of the gap between the two can be seen in how often each article has been historically invoked. At time of recording, I believe Article 4 has been invoked 9 times since NATO's foundation in 1949, all of them in the 21st century. By contrast, the more kinetic clause, Article 5, has been invoked exactly once, by the United States, after September 11, 2001. In summary, Poland selected a tool that indicated they thought this issue was serious, but not "we need to start bombing stuff" level of serious. While Warsaw didn't go for the Article 5 button, they were unambiguous as to what they thought had just occurred. In their eyes, the two critical points were that these were Russian drones and the crossing into Poland had been deliberate. But you might be wondering, what was Moscow saying? And what I'd argue we've seen from multiple Russian political figures talking about the incident is fairly standard Russian information practice when it comes to events like this. Rather than throwing up just a single assertion as to what happened with the supporting evidence, launch a saturation strike of different narratives and arguments into the information space, and at best, see what sticks, and at worst, try and muddy up the waters a bit. If I was to paraphrase some of the main arguments we saw after this started to come out, it might go something like this. The incident didn't happen, and if it did happen, we have no evidence pointing to Russia, and if we do have evidence pointing to Russia, then it's impossible because the drones didn't have the range to get to where they allegedly got to. And by the way, if all of this actually did happen somehow, then Ukraine did it, and the broader attempt to blame Russia is, as the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs put it, This is, quote, another link in a large-scale information campaign aimed at demonising Russia and mobilising additional support for the Kyiv regime, as well as an attempt to disrupt the political settlement of the conflict over Ukraine, end quote. So, yeah. Normally when major events happen, I tend to gloss over the narratives from the Kremlin, but in this case, they probably matter enough to be worth deconstructing. The war in Ukraine isn't just a military and economic contest, it's a political and information one. And Ukraine's fate hinges pretty heavily on political will in its major supporting states holding together. Incidents like this, coupled with the right narrative and information warfare efforts, probably aren't going to convince people in Poland or Romania that the Russian government is fantastic. But in order to achieve its objectives, Russian information warfare probably doesn't have to convince people to like Moscow. They just have to convince them to not support Ukraine. And in that case, a dangerous and unclear situation where the Ukrainians might be responsible for something might be exactly what the Kremlin ordered. So let's start from basically the top. Russia and the UN Security Council saying that not a single piece of evidence that the drones in Poland were of Russian provenance had been put forward to date. Now, I'm not a detective, but to help the guy out here, I'm going to put forward as Exhibit A the wreckage of Gerber-type drones in Poland. A type of drone that, as far as we know in the open source, is only manufactured and used by Russia. Does that 100% prove the drone was actually Russian? Strictly speaking, not. But if I see an F-22 Raptor flying, I'm going to logically conclude it's American. And if a Gerber crashes outside my hotel in Poland, I think it's reasonable to give the side eye to Moscow rather than Berlin or Paris. And somewhat amusingly, another argument we also saw the Russians use in the UN Security Council only really functions if you do assume that these were Gerbers. In that case, the Russian representative confirmed that Russia was launching drones against Ukrainian targets at the time, but without specifically saying that their drones didn't hit Poland, said that no targets were marked on Polish territory, and then made a pair of technical arguments that implied these weren't Russian drones. To paraphrase, he said the damage we saw done wasn't significant enough, suggesting any expert would confirm that if a drone warhead weighing tens of kilograms had exploded, the results would have been very different in a lot of these cases. And that secondly, the drones allegedly being used, the Gerberers, didn't have the range necessary to get to where it's claimed they got to. He gave a maximum range figure of 700 kilometres that, yes, would have ruled a number of these sites out, depending on where you assume they were launched from, but misses the fact, I'm sure very accidentally, that the Gerber is a flexible little design. In its standard configuration, if you like, the Gerber essentially functions as a cheap decoy for the larger Shahed-style drones. They can, and some of them do carry warheads, in part one imagines so that if the Ukrainians identify it, they feel compelled to shoot it down anyway. But the basic engineering here can be flexible. And if you look at some of the wreckage images we have from Poland, I've got one of them on the right there, we can see some potential evidence of that in the form of that soft bag that you see poking out of the front of the drone. That is an extra soft fuel tank in the drone where you might otherwise put a warhead. You need to remember these things are designed to be built as simply and cheaply as possible. In most cases, we are talking mid-tier shedcraft levels of engineering. Some of the images we've seen of Gerber wreckage from Ukraine show a soft fuel tank being used, kind of like the one we just saw, but positioned in the midsection of the fuselage, just ahead of the vertical stabilizer. Given its position, that tank probably shouldn't be poking out the front of the drone even after a crash, meaning we're either looking at a second fuel tank or a much enlarged one. So in that sense, the two arguments, that these didn't explode hard enough and they didn't have the range necessary, arguably solve each other. They didn't explode because, as the Poles have confirmed, although couldn't have known at the time, there were no warheads aboard, and they did have the range because they weren't hucking around any warhead weight and were potentially carrying additional fuel. And then, as to the conspiracy theory that Ukraine somehow did this, perhaps patching together drones from Russian debris and then launched them in the middle of a Russian attack, we could go through things like their flight paths being tracked even before they entered Poland. But here, we don't even strictly need NATO sources because we can instead look to what's been said by a Russian ally, Belarus. If, to entertain the conspiracy for a moment, this was a strike deliberately launched by the Ukrainians against the Poles in order to try and draw them into the war against Russia, then one imagines that Russian ally Belarus would probably have said as such. Instead, Minsk has publicly endorsed the "this was an accident" explanation, saying that they saw these Gerbers go off course as a result of being hit by electronic warfare, they actually shot some of them down over Belarusian territory, and they provided advance notice to Poland that they were coming, essentially allowing Lukashenko to, if you like, play geopolitical good cop to Putin's bad cop. The point here is twofold. Firstly, I'd argue most of the Russian objections just don't hold together. There's plenty of evidence that these were Russian drones and precious little evidence that they weren't. The other thing I'd say is that when you're trying to argue that this was just an accident, because accidents can happen, it's important not to view this incident or any incident just in isolation, which is why I started with the MiG-31s first. In a lot of cases, one data point can be an anecdote, but a bunch of them can become evidence. Finally, I'd also suggest that if Russia actually thought that they were being framed up by the Ukrainians or something of the kind, logically, they'd be acting very differently. I mean, if you were the Russians and you thought you were in the process of being framed up by NATO, surely your first response would be to stop doing things that made that easy, like flying jets incredibly close to NATO airspace, or launching drone attacks on targets very close to Ukraine's western frontier. Not even on an ongoing basis, just long enough to let the temperature come down a little. Instead, for the better part of 2 weeks, the cadence was fairly continuous. Drones flying into Polish airspace were soon followed by drones reportedly flying into Romanian airspace. Then the Estonian airspace incident a couple of days later. Basically what I'm saying is that if it looks like a Russian test, flies like a Russian test, and shapes decision-making like a Russian test, then for the rest of this episode, I'm content proceeding on the assumption that it was a Russian test. But if it was a test, what did it arguably show us, both about NATO's military preparedness and its political cohesion? I'd suggest, at least from what we've seen in public, the air defence picture is a bit of a polarised one. Against Russia's manned fixed-wing aircraft, I imagine the Alliance is probably pretty happy with how the system operated. The ability to respond to drone-based incursions, though, appears to be somewhat more inconsistent. We've seen cases of wreckage reportedly being found in countries like Poland or Romania without a report of the drones making their way across the border first, suggesting NATO air defence systems might not always be picking up all of these lower-end threats. The interceptions of the drones in Poland were also hardly flawless. Only a handful of the salvo being shot down, with an AMRAAM apparently going house hunting in the process. And some NATO figures have been quick to suggest that the difference in how the alliance was able to respond to Russian fighters as opposed to Russian drones speaks to a couple of potential gaps in allied capabilities. The fact that Polish fighters, for example, were forced to use full-sized air-to-air missiles in order to engage the Gerberers points to the lack of something more suitable in inventory. For US aircraft operating against Iranian and Houthi drones, for example, that's increasingly been the APKWS-2 guided rocket. But to do that, you need the rockets, the pod to designate for them, and the training to use them. And many European air forces, staring down a quantitatively ever greater Russian drone threat, have none of the above and no equivalent. Something which may help explain why NATO's Secretary-General felt the need to stress that it wasn't practical for the alliance to go forward continuing to shoot down relatively cheap drones with expensive air-to-air missiles. Also arguably missing are some of Ukraine's most successful defences against Russian one-way attack drones. Networks of acoustic sensors to detect and track them, and then gun and interceptor drone systems to affordably bring them down. While interceptor drones are increasingly becoming an integral part of Ukraine's air defence effort, no NATO state fields them as a mainstream air defence weapon, at least not yet. And as long as that remains the case, it might be relatively attractive for Russia to try and affordably draw out a very expensive defensive response from NATO by making sure that occasionally a couple of Gerberers get lost in the correct direction. And as other recent incidents have arguably shown, that drone threat might be even more acute when it's coupled with grey zone or hybrid tactics. Drones have repeatedly demonstrated to us just how fragile many of our societal systems are. Air travel in Russia is now routinely disrupted by Ukrainian long-range drone attacks, and in recent days it's just taken a handful of drone sightings, with no nation-state claiming responsibility, to repeatedly disrupt civilian and military flights in Denmark. In those cases, the challenges faced by Copenhagen arguably go even further than just detecting the drones in the first place. It's the challenge of bringing them down as safely as possible. Impromptu AMRAAM-delivered home renovations of the kind we saw in Poland generally aren't considered ideal. And when you're talking about potential interceptions over heavily populated areas, countries are probably going to want options that involve as little overkill as possible. So it's clear there's probably a requirement there for a better solution to defend critical infrastructure against these kind of low-cost hybrid threats. On the political side, NATO states appear to have at least publicly demonstrated themselves to be pretty unified on the topic of defending all of their member states, including those on the eastern flank. But there are still clearly differences of opinion on how kinetically NATO should respond to future Russian incursions into their airspace. Hungary, for example, called the drone flights over Poland unacceptable, but stressed that communication needed to continue with Moscow. Germany's defence minister has warned against the risk of NATO walking into Putin's escalation trap, as he put it, if they fire on a Russian aircraft, while Italy has warned the alliance against taking what they've described as the Kremlin's bait. At the other end of the spectrum, you have what you might call Team Turkish response. Bloomberg reported that the Dutch Prime Minister would be supportive of NATO bringing down a Russian aircraft if it violated NATO airspace. Poland publicly warned the Russians in the Security Council that if an aircraft violated NATO airspace and was brought down, then they shouldn't come to the Security Council afterwards to whine about it. And when asked the question, Mr. President, do you think NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace? US President Donald Trump responded simply, quote, yes, I do, end quote. Those public comments start to touch on the next big question here, which is basically, what happens next? So let's move on to that question of escalation management. What have we seen done so far? And what are the options that remain on the table? And the way I want to do this is start with a theory and then talk through in more detail what we've actually seen. In a very general sense, when responding to an escalation like this, a nation or alliance is going to have a couple of different tools available. There's diplomatic signalling, which you might be able to use to shape an opponent's decision-making, but that's generally going to be most effective if it's paired by the prospect of action. If you're coming at this from Warsaw's perspective, for example, one of your key goals here is probably to deter the Russians from continually doing this. And so you might want to find ways to disincentivize Russia from taking exactly those kind of actions. To that end, we've seen the Poles very publicly warn Moscow, with the foreign minister saying that the country shouldn't whine if its aircraft or missiles are shot down over NATO territory in the future. And according to reports, that messaging may have been backed up privately by other European diplomats speaking to the Russians behind closed doors, with Bloomberg reporting that diplomats from Britain, France and Germany met the Russians in Moscow, warning the Kremlin that, quote, NATO is ready to respond to further violations of its airspace with full force, including by shooting down Russian planes, according to officials familiar with the exchange, end quote. But despite that kind of rhetoric, the risk for individual NATO states, as Russia would be well aware, is that if they do vertically escalate to shooting down a Russian jet, there's always going to be a perceived risk that the rest of the alliance doesn't fall in behind whichever party decided to act. Poland, Estonia or Romania might prefer a scenario where they're able to actively dissuade the Russians from entering their airspace, for example, over one where they just have to watch them do it. But in each case, the just watch scenario is probably preferable to the worst third option, one where the nation takes a kinetic action, the rest of the alliance thinks they've gone too far, and a country or group of countries finds themselves facing a Russian response without the rest of the alliance at their back. Given that what you'd probably expect to see countries look for isn't so much an instant escalation to shooting down or shooting back, but instead an attempt to set conditions first. That political risk of potentially being caught out exposed in the diplomatic open is probably more significant for a lot of these NATO states than the risk of a Russian military response against the alliance as a whole. While yes, Alexei Meshkov, Russia's ambassador to France, has reportedly said that if NATO were to bring down a Russian aircraft, it would, quote, be war, end quote, at this point, I doubt most NATO capitals are going to treat a threat like that as credible. Threats of war or consequences have long been features of Russian rhetoric, going back to warnings over the delivery of weapon systems to Ukraine in 2022, 23 and 24. And even beyond the war in Ukraine, I'd argue there's also relevant precedent. From a time a NATO state did shoot down a Russian aircraft violating its airspace, at a time where most of the Russian military wasn't occupied, with the net result being that in the short term, Moscow did basically nothing. This was the case of a Russian Sukhoi 24 being shot down by the Turks back in 2015. In that case, a Russian jet didn't violate Turkish airspace for 12 minutes, it did it for closer to 17 seconds. But that was apparently long enough after the Russian aircraft had disregarded several warnings for a Turkish F-16 to bring it down. After the news of those Foxhounds touring Estonian airspace started to become public, some were quick to make comparisons to the Turkish incident. But to be fair to the precedent, I think it's important to remember that there's kind of more to the story than things escalating from zero to a shoot-down suddenly in 2015. The Turks had very publicly announced that they would be changing their rules of engagement to be more shoot first, ask questions later, as far back as 2012. They'd subsequently shot down a number of aircraft flying for Assad's forces, a helicopter in 2013 and a MiG-23 in 2014. What they didn't do, however, was escalate to shooting down any actual Russian aircraft. In October 2015, though, the Turks publicly protested what they described as a Russian violation of their airspace. The next month in November, the Russian ambassador and military attaché were reportedly brought in and warned of the rules of engagement that were in place. And it was only several days after that meeting, on November 24th, when the shootdown actually took place. The point is that there was plenty of telegraphing and warning by the Turks, publicly and privately, before they actually escalated to the point of bringing down a plane. And so if we do see NATO escalate to that point, I expect it will only be after plenty of warnings have been given and the political work within the alliance has been done to establish where the lines are and make sure that everyone's on board. Because remember, from a strategic perspective, NATO's goal here isn't to shoot down Russian aircraft. At most, that's a means to an end. And at worst, it could actually play directly into Russia's hands. Instead, the goals you'll probably hear a lot about are things like deterring Russia, protecting the alliance members, and trying to make sure that Moscow doesn't achieve its strategic objectives in Ukraine. From one perspective, if the VKS wants to trade some of the valuable remaining flight hours on its MiG-31s or its strategic bombers poking around the edges of NATO airspace, then as long as they're not actively violating it or posing a military threat to the alliance or its cohesion, given the disparity in available resources, there's probably some in NATO that would call that an overall win. So if the goal is to deter Moscow without necessarily going straight to the big red Sam button, although it might eventually come to that, what I think we're likely to see, and already started to see, is NATO states taking other steps that weaken the Russian position or take away their options without going straight into vertical escalation. And we can generally fit those responses or potential responses into two primary categories. Defensive adaptations intended to increase the difficulty and risk of further Russian actions of this kind, and what you might call more offensive options. We'll start with that first category first. The drones in Poland were the impetus for NATO to launch Operation Eastern Sentry. That involved surging additional allied assets to the region, including fighter aircraft and air defence systems, some of which became relevant just over a week later when we saw those Foxhounds over the Baltic. The challenge I'd suggest here from a Russian perspective is that when you try and use military means to apply coercive pressure, as we've seen in these cases, there's always a risk of that method becoming essentially self-defeating. You complain about the balance and situation with NATO and so invade Ukraine and end up with a NATO that's expanding and remilitarizing as a result. You poke an air defence soft spot in the Baltic and get an announcement that Italy will be extending the deployment of its SAMP-T air defence system in Estonia, and you provide an incentive for Estonia to carry on with its own planned acquisition of a long-range air defence system. So on paper at least, Tallinn might gain the ability to bring down Russian aircraft using its own assets, rather than being strictly reliant on its allies to pull the trigger for it. And as for the drone vulnerability, we might be seeing movement in that area as well. Multiple European states have now called for the creation of what they're calling a drone wall. In terms of naming, that's probably more marketing term than literal descriptor, but a key feature of the effort is something some commentators and voices of NATO have been calling for years at this point. Engaging with the Ukrainians to harvest their expertise on dealing with the Russian long-range drone threat and arranging technology transfer on things like interceptor drones, and their potential production and introduction into the European market. So far, the war in Ukraine has mostly seen transfers of hardware and training services in one direction, from the various allies into Ukraine. By repeatedly emphasising the nature of the drone threat to European leaders and populations, it's possible Russia might be making a major contribution to catalysing that flow in the other direction. Given Russia's stated preference for rolling back NATO and keeping Ukraine out of it, I'm not sure I'd be too quick to call greater cooperation and technology transfer between the two a victory for the Kremlin. But if you go back to basics, it can be hard to deter using defence alone. And one of the big threats to Moscow in all this is that if NATO states are looking for ways to pressure Russia into stopping its border incursions or provocations of this kind, they arguably have some pretty good options in order to do so. As we discussed earlier, Russia probably doesn't want this to escalate past the find-out phase militarily, but at the same time, there's a bit of asymmetry in just how easily either side can poke each other in a damaging way. Russia, for example, probably can't launch direct missile strikes on military targets in NATO territory without a massive degree of diplomatic and military risk. But as long as Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine, NATO does kind of have that option, just with one intermediate step in between. Instead of firing a weapon at a Russian target, you can instead hand it to the Ukrainians first, and then leave the logistics of arranging a high-speed delivery to them. If one of Russia's potential goals here is to try and weaken NATO's political cohesion or get it to keep more air defence systems at home rather than providing support to the Ukrainians, then logically it follows that one of the ways to dissuade them from doing that is showing that incursions result in more aid, not less. For example, Germany's Chancellor has recently said that they needed a, quote, new push to change Moscow's calculus, end quote, and linked that to a proposal to give Ukraine an interest-free loan of roughly $163 billion backed by frozen Russian assets. On the pain scale, a Ukraine with $160 billion worth of additional funding is probably going to hurt Russia a heck of a lot more than losing a handful of old airframes. Another example of that potential model of response, although I don't necessarily consider it likely, at least in the near or medium term, would be approving Ukrainian requests for particularly high-impact weapon systems. We recently saw it reported, for example, that Ukraine had requested Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States, and that President Trump was reportedly at least open to the idea. By US standards, a lot of Tomahawk models are old technology, But in Ukrainian hands, they'd represent a significant uptick in their ability to effectively demolish high-value targets, whether that be defence industrial facilities, air bases, or Russian oil refineries, which, given those strikes are already happening, probably has less escalation risk involved than shooting down a Russian aircraft, while at the same time potentially imposing a lot more cost on the Russians. That's not to say Russia would be entirely without the ability to respond to those kind of moves, but I think it highlights one of the strategic luxuries that the NATO states have in this particular scenario. It's not a binary choice between doing nothing or taking the risk of shooting down Russian aircraft. They can potentially achieve a lot of the coercive impact you would normally require direct kinetic action to achieve, without having to take the risk of firing a shot or launching a strike directly. So I think it'll be interesting to see whether any NATO states ultimately decide to take up that option of using support for Ukraine as a way to reinforce deterrence via Moscow. In terms of pain level, I'd argue there's a fairly significant difference between the prospect of losing a couple of drones and having a cruise missile or 10 slam into a missile factory or refinery. That said, just because it now looks like Russia might be dealing with even more NATO on its border, and NATO states have some relatively good response options available if they choose to use them, that doesn't mean I'd be too quick to rule this overall strategy a loser for Moscow. Because really, we're still only in the early stages of the response. It's not clear if or when Russia will take additional actions of this kind, and whether it ultimately proves to be a net benefit for Moscow or not ultimately comes down to a range of unknowns. But I want to focus on just two. The first is what this means for Ukraine, and specifically military assistance to Ukraine. One potential payoff for Russia might be that if they can create enough apprehension about drone and air threats within NATO, that might pressure NATO leaders to prioritise air defence systems and air defence munitions for their own forces as opposed to providing them to Ukraine. If the public is seeing airports shut down by drones, hearing stories of Russian UAS flying over their territory, or seeing Foxhounds casually jaunt across the Baltic, they might raise a bit of an eyebrow if they see Patriots, SAMTs, or anti-drone munitions like APKWS being sent to help Kyiv instead. Now, from an escalation management perspective, you could probably argue that providing those systems to the Ukrainians has a lot more coercive and deterrence value than keeping them at home. And if the perceived problem in question is Russian drones or aircraft, one of the more cost-efficient ways to mitigate that threat might be to give the Ukrainians what they need to get rid of said Russian drones or aircraft. But there is absolutely no guarantee that kind of logic wins out in the political debate. And if Russia can cause even a battery or two of air defence systems to be diverted from Ukraine to reinforce the eastern flank, then you could argue that would be a pretty significant payoff for the cost of flying a couple of MiG-31s for a few hours and flinging some low-cost Gerber decoy drones over Poland. Also not entirely clear yet is whether this will result in an increase or decrease in the cohesion of NATO. An ideal outcome for Russia, for example, would probably be an open split over how to respond to these kind of Russian actions. If some states want to adopt forceful measures while others want to try and de-escalate in response, Russia might see it as a way to dig at the soft underbelly of one of NATO's most valuable assets, its all-for-one concept. So far, NATO generally appears to have held together well and found additional resources to respond to the threat. But alliance politics are always going to be complicated, and you can expect Moscow to have pretty clear incentives to create fissures wherever they can. If the payoff to Russia in terms of diminished aid to Ukraine or political issues within the NATO alliance are still unknown, so too are the costs they might pay for getting those benefits. This is where the unknowns about escalation come in, with it remaining to be seen whether Russia will essentially face not much more than some harsh rhetoric and a stronger NATO eastern flank, or whether we see some sort of horizontal or vertical counter-escalation from NATO. While a lot of NATO states have very strong incentives to avoid a major escalation, I'd argue Moscow does as well. It might benefit from being able to poke NATO, to test it, to undermine confidence in Article 5 and mutual defence, and it may well be that if they see what they perceive to be a vulnerability or opportunity in the future, they might move to try and seize it. But Russia simply doesn't have the economic or military strength right now for a wider confrontation. To apply the appropriate Australian academic parlance to the issue, they might have pretty strong strategic imperatives to continuously start shit, but they cannot afford to get hit. And so in closing, while these events are clearly significant, I think it's also important to try and keep them in perspective. Careful escalation, hybrid warfare and grey zone tactics are all part of the Russian strategic playbook. They're tools that exist in the Russian toolkit for a reason, and they're something NATO states will likely feel a strong imperative to respond to and deter. But the overwhelming focus of Russia's objectives and its resources are still squarely focused on Ukraine. And whether tensions with NATO wax or wane in the coming weeks or months, that's still the primary battleground here. You could argue Russia has pretty strong strategic reasons to want to turn the eyes of the world to Poland, to Denmark, to Romania or Moldova. But whether or not the Russian strategy ultimately bears fruit is likely to hinge on decisions that go well beyond that, where the state of war is much clearer and the grey zone has long given way to trench lines and a war that's altogether more black and white. And okay, channel update to close out, although forgive me if I speed through this a bit as I am recovering from a cold. Although I guess when you spend as much time in airports as I do, that kind of just comes with the territory. In part because of that though, I did make the decision to slightly adjust the scope on this episode. Originally I was going to cover Russia's West 2025 military exercises in Belarus as well, but instead I'll try and integrate them and some of the observations that came out of them into a future episode. In terms of other updates, thank you very much for the positive reception to the episode on DSEI in London. Don't expect those Peru road trip episodes to become an overly common thing, but without saying too much yet, there might be one more surprise of that kind coming down the pipeline before the end of the year. What I'll try and make sure of, though, is that the travel required doesn't impact the release schedule on the channel itself. Speaking of the channel, Peru Gaming is now up and running again, courtesy of a couple of episodes I recorded while in transit, thanks to the fact I've now actually found a couple of titles that I can run on the travel laptop, including the one I'm doing at the moment, ICBM Escalation. There are also a couple of other updates I could go over, but given the circumstances, hopefully you'll understand if I decide to hold those over until next week. So for the moment, let me just say thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of the episode. And with any luck, I hope to see you all again, with my voice back, next week.